Challenging arbitrary rule is the world's most difficult task, especially when undemocratic control has become firmly established. Faced with overwhelming odds, many in bondage elect survival over open resistance, and the choice is as logical and understandable as it is painful. For those who choose to defy the odds and test the boundaries of their confinement, no one effective model exists. Therefore, they try all imaginable models of resistance, calculated and spontaneous, covert and direct, psychological and physical, individual and collective. Despite the monotony of enslavement, no two circumstances are ever exactly alike, so the best tactic yesterday may be the most costly or foolhardy today. Adaptability is crucial, and bravery is a constant ingredient, for even the smallest gesture of defiance can result in cruel punishment and lasting consequences. Small acts of resistance, though dangerous, were regular events in the house of bondage. The slightest command could be wrongly interpreted or carelessly carried out. The easiest task could be purposefully bungled or endlessly extended. By breaking a tool or pretending to be sick, slaves could avoid a whole day's work, gaining needed rest for themselves and undercutting steady profits for their owner. Workers forced to labor to support the life of a master often felt justified in appropriating some of the food they had grown and prepared, even if the planter viewed this activity as stealing. Elaborate trading and marketing networks grew up to exchange such goods. Though the owner might encourage slave gardens to reduce his own expense in feeding his workforce, he objected when these gardens received more attention than his fields, or when the slaves sold their own produce and defiantly pocketed the profits. No act of defiance was more commonplace than running away. Even brief departures could provide relief from an oppressive overseer, but such disappearances also deprived the owners of their daily profits, so penalties were often harsh, especially for repeated offenders. In 1748, 20-year-old Cato was wearing more than a flannel jacket, worn leather breeches, tattered shoes, and an old beaver hat when he slipped away, once again, from the silversmith shop of his Philadelphia owner. According to the Pennsylvania Gazette, he had been forced to wear irons on his legs and about his neck, though the paper added that he probably has cut them off, as he had done several times before on the like occasion. When Hannah, age 18, ran away from her Virginia master 6 times in as many months, she had her hair cut in a very irregular manner as punishment for offenses. In North Carolina, individuals who persisted in running away were often forced to wear heavy neck yokes as a penalty. Magistrates could not assess fines against persons who are forbidden to own property. Therefore, minor acts of defiance prompted harsh physical punishment such as whipping, branding, or wearing of shackles. Moreover, masters were free to inflict their own forms of retribution. Equiano never forgot the horrible sight that confronted him the first time he entered a white dwelling just days after he had arrived in Virginia. I had seen a black woman slave as I came through the house who was cooking the dinner, and the poor creature was cruelly loaded with various kinds of iron machines. She had one particularly on her head, which locked her mouth so fast that she could scarcely speak, and she could not eat or drink. I was much astonished and shocked at the contrivance, which I afterwards learned was called the iron muzzle. Seeing or experiencing such inhuman treatment could only sharpen the resentments and deepen the bitterness of a worker in bondage. The resulting rage often found expression in acts of extreme violence. Overseers were beaten to death by angry work hands in the field. Masters and their families were poisoned by desperate servants in the kitchen. Setting fires also became a favorite act of defiance, since arson, like poisoning food, was difficult to prove and easy to deny. Burning a loaded barn at harvest time was a way to avoid unwelcome work and deprive the owner of a year's profit. Even the desperate act of suicide took on a double meaning, for it freed the black worker from bondage and deprived the white owner of a valuable investment. Black violence against the system of slavery ranged from spontaneous individual acts to elaborate conspiracies involving numerous people. Among enslaved African Americans, as among any people living under totalitarian control, thought of rebellion was universal. Open talk of such matters was far more guarded, and the undertaking itself was the bold and rare exception. For a variety of reasons, urban slaves were closely watched and rural slaves were widely dispersed. Organized patrols were commonplace, and informants were everywhere. Long working hours and wide distances made communication difficult, as did forced illiteracy and diverse ethnic backgrounds. Despite such huge obstacles, brave individuals joined in risky coalitions to attempt mass escape or armed insurrection. Leaders of such collective designs always had to consider the same array of difficult questions. Could they build wide support without opening the door to dissension or betrayal? Could they take advantage of divisions among whites or natural disasters such as storms or epidemics without sacrificing control over timing? Could they buy, steal, or capture enough weapons to win an immediate victory that would bring additional people and resources to their cause? Could they generate the ruthless violence needed for such an undertaking while still enforcing the restraint and cooperation necessary for success? Could they learn from earlier experiences without becoming too discouraged by the woeful outcome of past conspiracies? Often the answer to several of these questions was no, and the plotters reluctantly dropped their scheme before passing the point of no return. Occasionally, however, an event took on a life of its own, as rumors of revolt fueled fears among whites and raised hopes among African Americans. Word of a foreign war, a heavenly sign, or a slave rebellion in some other colony could quickly bring matters to a head, increasing the sense of urgency among enslaved blacks and feeling of paranoia among those who exploited them. In New York City in 1712, workers desiring their freedom set fire to a building and attacked those summoned to put out the blaze. They managed to kill 9 persons and wound 7 others, but they failed to spark a larger revolt. Half a dozen accused conspirators committed suicide after their capture, and more than 20 were put to death, some by being burned alive. According to New York's governor, there has been the most exemplary punishment that could possibly be thought of. Capital punishment was also used in the small French colony of Louisiana, when several hundred Bambara people, who had recently been brought from Africa, planned a revolt that was to begin in late June 1731. The rebellion might have succeeded, but a remark by a defiant African woman tipped off authorities. They were surprised to learn that the leader was a man known as Samba Bambara, who had worked as interpreter for the slave trade at Galam on the Senegal River in West Africa. After falling out of favor with French authorities there, he had been thrown aboard the slave ship Annibal in 1726 and shipped to Louisiana, where he was soon put to work as a trusted overseer. According to Lepage du Prats, who investigated the case, 8 suspected leaders, including Samba, were clapped in irons by authorities and then were put to the torture of burning matches, which, though several times repeated, could not bring them to make any confessions. When further evidence prompted an admission of guilt, Dupratz reported that the 8 Negroes were condemned to be broken alive on the wheel, tied to a wagon wheel, and battered severely until they gradually died of shock. Meanwhile, the woman who had revealed the plot was sentenced to be hanged before their eyes, which was accordingly done. Even then, rumors of revolt continued, but an uprising predicted to begin during midnight mass on Christmas 1731 never materialized. Meanwhile, slaves had been escaping occasionally from South Carolina and making their way to St. Augustine in northern Florida. Spanish officials had bestowed freedom on some of the refugees in hopes of disrupting the neighboring English colony, while others, such as a Mandingo man named Francisco Menendez, were resold in servitude. In 1728, Menendez was a captain of the slave militia, a unit organized to help protect St. Augustine from English attack. In 1733, the Spanish king issued an edict granting freedom to runaway slaves reaching St. Augustine, and in 1738, the local governor granted these newcomers a town site several miles north of the port city. In return, dozens of converted freedmen pledged to shed their last drop of blood in defense of the great crown of Spain and the Holy Faith, and to be the most cruel enemies of the English. While Menendez, as their leader, they constructed a fortification known as Mos, or Musa, or Mosa. 2 decades later, this small fort, which has recently been located and excavated, still sheltered a community of 67 men, women, and children. By 1739, a great many of the 40,000 African Americans in bondage in South Carolina were aware that the Spaniards in Florida had offered freedom to slaves from English colonies. In September, when word reached Charleston of the outbreak of open war between England and Spain, the news helped trigger an uprising at Stono Landing, south of the city. During the brief and bloody Stono Rebellion, scores of slaves killed their English masters and began marching toward Fort Mose and Spanish St. Augustine, only to be intercepted before their numbers could swell. Fearful of the colony's expanding black majority, officials displayed the heads of executed rebels on poles to discourage future revolts. In addition, they placed a prohibitive duty or tax on slaves imported from abroad for several years, and they passed a new Negro Act, further restricting the movement and assembly of black South Carolinians. A suspected slave plot in New York in 1741 led even more fearsome reprisals, fueled by suggestions of underground support and encouragement from Spanish Jesuits and local poor whites. British conflict with Spain had given hope to slaves in England's North American colonies. Similarly, when England and France became locked in an all-out imperial war in the 1750s, white colonists again became anxious. They feared that enslaved African Americans would take advantage of warfare on the frontiers and seek to challenge their miserable condition. In 1755, British troops under General Edward Braddock suffered a shocking defeat in the backcountry at the hands of the French and their Indian allies. When word of the setback at Fort Duquesne reached the governor of Maryland, he immediately circulated a notice that slaves should be well observed and watched, when he ordered the colony's militia units to be prepared to quell, in this case, any insurrection should be occasioned by this stroke. Officials in Virginia also worried about the potential for rebellion. More than 100,000 blacks now made up over a third of the total population in that province, and many of the white militiamen were absent in the war. The lieutenant governor reported that local slaves had become very audacious in the wake of Braddock's defeat in the Ohio Valley. These poor creatures imagine, he wrote condescendingly, that the French will give them their freedom. We have too many here, but I hope we shall be able to defeat the designs of our enemies and keep these slaves in proper subject. In South Carolina, where blacks outnumbered whites by roughly 3-2, authorities made plans to separate Charleston from the mainland with a canal to be dug by slaves, so the city might be somewhat a protection against an insurrection of the Negroes in the surrounding countryside, or an attack by Indians from the frontier. Charleston's leaders were not wrong to think that their town and their lives were in serious danger. In March 1759, with warfare again brewing on the South Carolina frontier, a free black man named Philip John was whipped and branded for spreading talk of insurrection and saying that within 6 months, all the whites would be killed. Enraged rather than deterred by his harsh punishment, John expanded his design throughout the spring. He traveled through the country, claiming to have had a vision that in September, the month of the early rebellion at Stono, the sword should go through the land. After this bloody revolution, he argued, there should be no more white kings, governor, or great men, but the Negroes should live happily and have laws of their own. When Charleston officials got wind of the cabal, they arrested Philip John once again. They soon reported that he and his associates apparently had planned to seize a storehouse filled with arms and ammunition, and then with what force they could collect to have marched to this town. For his dream of revolt, John was put to death. The end of the Great War of Empire brought dramatic changes to the colonies. In Paris in 1762, British representatives sat down with envoys from France and Spain to negotiate a final peace. Their treaty, completed the following year, gave decisive advantage to the victorious British under their young French monarch George III. From the King of France, they received control over Canada. From Spain, the Catholic ally of France, they gained hold of what had for 200 years been Spanish Florida. These sweeping shifts in the colonial landscape had an immediate impact on all the people of eastern North America. Among Indians, for example, it is no coincidence that the major uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion began in 1763, as Native Americans in the Great Lakes region lost their strategic bargaining position between French and English colonizers. Many African Americans also felt an immediate impact from the peace settlement. In Florida, hundreds of blacks had been imported as laborers from the West Indies or had escaped from slavery in neighboring English colonies. Many of them departed with the Spanish as they evacuated St. Augustine in 1763. At the same time, thousands of African Americans enslaved in nearby Georgia and South Carolina saw a sudden end to the dream of escaping to Fort Mose. As the freedom fighters of the Stono Rebellion had attempted to do a generation earlier, Florida quickly changed from an outpost of possible black liberty to a new frontier for English plantations. Rich investors in Charleston and Savannah transported several thousand workers to British Florida in hopes of earning quick profits from slave labor. A few of these African Americans managed to escape the joined bands of Creek Indians in what would be known as the Seminole Nation. The rest died in bondage. Elsewhere, on the British colonial frontier, the end of the so-called French and Indian War brought immediate change for African Americans. In the North, numerous servants and free blacks had taken advantage of the turmoil of war to travel more freely. Some served white officers, while others cut roads, built fortifications, and transported supplies. Still others enlisted as soldiers. Gershom Prince, for example, had been born in New England in 1733 and apparently went to war with Captain Robert Dirk. He must have been issued a musket to fight, for he inscribed a traditional powder container made with a cow's horn when the soldiers paused at Crown Point in 1761 following their victory over the French. 17 years later, at age 45, Prince was back in service in the American Revolution, fighting for the Patriot side. When he was killed in the Battle of Wyoming, Pennsylvania in 1778, he was once again carrying his carved powder horn. The years between the end of one great war and the beginning of another would be eventful ones for the African Americans in their strange new land. To the west of the English colonies, the end of the war with France also brought change for African Americans. George III and his government ministers were fearful that expanding settlement would encroach on Native American land and provoke an expensive Indian war. Britain, deeply in debt after the struggle with France, wanted to avoid such a costly undertaking, so the king proclaimed a boundary line running along the top of the Appalachian Mountains to divide the Atlantic colonies from Indian nations living in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. This so-called proclamation line plus the willingness of colonial officials to pay bounties for Native Americans for capturing runaways, held down the number of enslaved blacks who risked seeking freedom in Indian country. An act by the Virginia Assembly thought in good policy to keep up and increase the natural aversion which happily subsists between Negroes and Indians. Efforts to prohibit interracial mixing on the frontier were not new. When a German named Christian Pryber had gone to live among the Cherokees in the 1730s, announcing his plans for an interracial utopia without private property where all races would be welcome, he was hunted down by authorities and imprisoned in Georgia until he died in 1744. Nevertheless, the backcountry was so large and so thinly populated that it was impossible for white authorities to prevent non-whites from settling together along the frontier. In 1740, Molly Barber, daughter of a wealthy white New England family, eloped with James Chogum, a Narragansett Indian. The couple established the small community of Barkhamsted in northwest Connecticut, which soon drew a number of Indians, poor whites, and free blacks. In 1758, Mary Jameson, a Scots-Irish immigrant girl, was captured by Indians and lived most of her life among the Senecas in what is now upstate New York. She later told of staying briefly with two African-American runaways at a remote cabin near the Genesee River. She and her children helped harvest their corn crop and passed the winter in the frontier homestead. Besides affecting African Americans on the borders of the empire, Britain's dramatic triumph over France had also had a swift impact upon blacks living in the heart of the mainland colonies. Soon after 1763, the political climate began to change dramatically.